Until today, I remembered my visits to Mrs. Burnage's house quite fondly. The neighborhood I lived in was small, with only 10 houses on the whole street. Each house was placed far apart, with everyone having at least 3 acres of property. Our house was at one end of the road, and Mrs. Burnage's was at the other. Mrs. Burnage was a sweet lady, probably in her late 50s, when my 3 sisters, Jason Adams, who was another younger kid in the neighborhood, and I would go visit her. I visited her from ages 8 to 13. Mrs. Burnage didn't have children of her own. She wasn't able to, according to my mom. She loved it when we would come over, and we did too. Even though she didn't have any of her own kids, her house was a child's dream. When you walked in, there were 2 living areas, one to the right, another to the left. The one on the right was normal enough. It had couches, a television, a coffee table, and a few hunted animals hanging on the wall. The one to the left, which is a step lower than the rest of the house, was a child's paradise. The main thing I remember about that room was that she had one of those red popcorn machine carts. As soon as we would come over, she'd put in fresh popcorn kernels and butter and have it hot and ready for us in just minutes after arrival. She had dolls with elaborate dollhouses all over the room for the girls, and she had trucks, Legos, Kinects, an assortment of balls, and even a pinball machine for the boys. We would play there for hours and never tire of it. Mrs. Burnage didn't seem to either. She loved listening to us play. She'd make cookies and smile broadly when she'd hear us laugh. She always told us that our laughter was the happiest sound. We loved our time in that playroom, but we particularly looked forward to the summers when she'd let us play in the pool. She had a normal-sized in-ground swimming pool in her backyard. She would let us go out there as soon as the temperature outside hit 80 degrees. Each year, she had a fresh batch of floating noodles and water toys for us to play with. She even surprised us one year and bought us a pool slide. We would shriek with laughter as we slid down and splashed into the pool. And even though Jason was 6 years younger than I was, we bonded by tormenting my sisters. We'd pretend that we were alligators and sneak up behind or even underneath my sisters, chomp on their legs with our arms, and make them squeal. We'd call after them as we swam away, "Alligators always eat squealing pigs," and laugh our heads off. Mrs. Burnage would prepare us lemonade, sit on the poolside lounge, and often played the Beach Boys on her boombox. She was always watching us, smiling. When I was 13, Jason ran away from home. We had always talked about running away, and had even made maps of where we would go. We built a fort in the woods out of fallen limbs and rocks. We even made a roof using bark and moss for shingles in case it rained. When he finally did run away, he left a note telling his parents why. They didn't let him play Nintendo on weeknights. I was upset that he didn't invite me. When he ran away, he left with only his favorite red hoodie and blue jeans, his backpack, some granola bars, and peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. I had figured that he ran away to our fort, but when I went down to the fort, he wasn't there. He never came back home, and his parents never found him, nor did they ever find his body. They moved out of the neighborhood shortly thereafter. I don't think they could stand being where there were so many memories. His disappearance shook the entire neighborhood, but Mrs. Burnage seemed to take Jason's disappearance particularly hard. At first she said that she didn't feel well, but after a while, she just told us to stop coming over. I remember when she told us that because her words hurt. "I don't want you coming over ever again. I don't need you around." I grew up, got over Mrs. Burnage's rejection, went to college, and I have recently moved back home. I've been reminiscing old times. I have gone on long drives through the countryside, visited old friends, and today, I decided to visit Mrs. Burnage. I walked over to her house and rang the doorbell. Mrs. Burnage's footsteps grew louder, and she came to the door, slowly turned the handle, and cracked the door open. She looked much older and seemed to have shrunk a little bit. Peering out from the small opening, she looked me up and down and asked me, "Who are you and what do you want?" It's been 13 years since she's seen me, so I couldn't expect her to recognize me. I smiled and said, "Mrs. Burnage, it's me, Michael. I'm the niece's son. I used to come play at your house." Her eyes opened, along with the door, upon recognition. She invited me in, and I was happy to see that not much had changed. There were still children's toys in the room we used to play in, along with the red and gold popcorn machine. The main living area looked much the same, maybe with some updated furniture and different mounted deer heads and pheasants adorning the walls. She asked me if I'd like some popcorn, and I, for old time's sake, did. I sat on the step that leads down into the playroom and listened to the popcorn popping while I chatted with Mrs. Burnage, telling her what I'd done with my life. I heard children laughing near the pool. I felt glad that she had started letting kids back over to the house. Playing at her house were some of my fondest memories. She had always been so nice and must have felt lonely without children around. I asked her if the kids playing were some of the neighborhood kids. She responded happily, almost bouncing as she told me, "Oh yes, the niece's kids and the Adams boy came over to play in the pool. I sure do love it when they come over." The poor lady, I thought, must be going senile, and I started to remind her, "Mrs. Burnage, I'm Michael. We are all grown up now, remember? The Adams has moved away, and the nieces don't have any..." I trailed off, heart pounding, as I heard something eerily familiar coming from the pool. I heard little girls shrieking and boys jeering after them. "Alligators always eat squealing pigs." I looked over my shoulder and could see the open door that led to the pool. Mrs. Burnage's boombox was plugged in and propping the door open. As I realized that the sound was coming from the boombox and not from any children, I turned to see Mrs. Burnage's expression change from warm and slightly vacant to cold and furious. The room seemed to darken and grow hot as she bellowed, throwing the bag of hot popcorn at me. "I told you that I didn't want you coming over ever again. I told you I don't need you anymore. Leave me alone." I left quickly and she followed me outside and stood in the doorstep, watching every one of my retreating steps. As I moved along the road, I could still hear the recorded voices and laughter of my sisters, me, and Jason. My stomach turned as I thought about just how creepy this all was. But then my turning stomach dropped to the ground as I looked back at a wide-eyed, staring Mrs. Burnage, and then through the gate at the backyard pool. Standing by the pool was what appeared to be a statue. I was pretty far away at this point, but the figure appeared to be a little boy, immobile, looking through the gate into the woods behind the house. The boy was wearing a familiar red hoodie and blue jeans. Did I ever mention Mr. Burnage? He was a taxidermist.